are these people?
I brought this article. I saw it from Vanessa Beeley shared it. Shared a little expert from it and posted a link and started reading. Thought, oh, this will be good. We've talked about this before. And was heavily surprised by the article. So I figured we'd give it a shot. And it's from a place I don't think we've done stuff from before. So even better. So this is from the Institute for Palestinian Studies, right? Author Aziz Yafi, which we'll get to that name in a bit. It might sound familiar to some people. But they write digging with tunnels, anonymous publishing as intellectual resistance. So I titled this clandestine publishing, which is another way to say that. But we'll get into that. I also like my picture. I feel like digging tunnels with pins was a really good imagery for me. So, but anyway, they write academic institute responded to pro-Palestinian voices on their campuses by immediately censoring, intimidating, and defaming anyone who challenged institutional power. However, largely thanks to the global student intifada, these institutions' walls are beginning to crumble. Still, work remains to dismantle the structures of supremacy, coloniality. There it is. I got it.
Right.
English. And racism within these spaces. So, you as a teacher, I felt like this was useful to you, and as an academic in general. So we'll continue a bit, but in almost all universities across the Western genocidal world where I write from, this censorship is starkly visible. Students, faculty, and staff alike are targeted, and the university remains passive, unwilling to safeguard the freedom of speech it claims to champion. This suppression mirrors a broader trend in Western academia where coloniality, decolonization is only accepted as a subject of study, used as a buzzword that interprets but does not interrupt institutions. Decolonization is vehemently resisted when it seeks to challenge or disrupt the material structures of power. The university cannot allow for decolonial theory to become a tangible anti-colonial praxis, threatening the foundations of which these institutions are built. What does that sound like, Collin?
Capitalism.
What?
Yep.
Oh, sorry. But as scholars, we are forced to confront the uncomfortable reality that Western institutions cannot truly be decolonized. What do we do then with the very structures we seek to change, enforce the limits on our activism, writing, and thoughts? I propose an alternative solution. Clandestine publishing is a form of intellectual resistance and is a pathway to knowledge production that bypasses the gatekeepers of Western academia and operates beyond its restrictive boundaries. Clandestine publishing allows us to topple institutional walls, reveal the weakness of the powerful, and center the hope and vitality of the struggle. Now, you asked me what that was when I put this story in yesterday. Well, I figured I'm very much, our brains are alike. Like, people should probably know the definition of that, right? So from Wikipedia, clandestine literature, also called underground literature, refers to a type of editorial and publishing process that involves self-publishing works, often in contradiction with the legal standards of a location. Clandestine literature is often an attempt to circumvent censorship, prosecution, or other suppression. So that's what this person is talking about, right? Self-publishing, physical items, right? Things in real space. Yes.
Underground.
Right. Well, because you're not going to get published in any of the main publications. So it's going to have to be.
Well, I mean, if it's in Palestine, it's gone.
Yes.
So,
and
then obviously, as we reported, their school infrastructure, university infrastructure is also gone.
You are a study of world history, and especially of religious world history. What is clandestine publishing to you? What does that harken back to? You know, like,
well, Well, it kind of brings me the first thought, like if you're looking at it in terms of the Bible, especially in the Roman era
Sure.
where Christianity was kind of outlawed,
Yep.
it was, now given that at that time a lot of the stuff was taught orally, there
Yes.
was a lot of oral tradition there.
And that
So,
kept
but
going
often than
through.
not, if you right, but often if you wanted to learn more, or if you wanted if you wanted to learn more about the Bible, or if in terms of the teachings of Jesus, like you had to go probably to a secret location
Yeah.
um, within the empire as hosting would kind of share. So basically what we like
So,
today, what we kind of consider Bible study, that's what they will actually do, but they will actually
yep.
have to do it in secret. And then
So,
just kind of going along with that,
fast
just a
forward
second,
to.
even in the modern era, like especially for churches that are evangelizing in other countries where Christianity may not be
Yep.
as prominent, thinking of China, at least back in the day, that was
Sure.
also something
With their
that would
the fish
right,
mirrors. I remember that.
exactly, right,
But fast forward a bit to, Martin Luther, not the junior one, but the actual one with his Gutenberg
right,
press, right?
hmm
Uh, printing the Bible in German at the time, right? Um,
yes,
so that's a big factor. We're talking about little red books being published. We're talking about and someone in the chat will remind me of the Revolutionary War one, right? That little red book that got printed around. You talk about all those guys, Franklin and all them ran publishing stuff, right? They had their own printing press. So that kind of thing is, I think, important. And it's something we don't talk about here in the space. We've talked about it with people like the Uhuru movement who have their own newsletter, right? Actual print uh
hmm
literature and stuff to hand out. But
right,
this article continues. So since 2021, censorship of pro-Palestine speech in the UK has surged by 450%, according to reports from various legal and civil rights groups. These repression extends beyond universities, infiltrating workplaces, schools, and public spaces. Employees have been suspended or dismissed for as little as wearing a keffiyeh, while students have been subjected to surveillance under programs such as Prevent, which falsely equates pro-Palestinian speech with signs of radicalization. The campaign of silencing is deeply entrenched in university culture. Zionist organizations like the Committee for Accuracy in Middle East Reporting and Analysis, aka CAMRA, employ students to spy on pro Palestinian voices on campuses, incentivizing them to falsely accuse their peers of anti Semitism. This is all while powerful lobbying groups, such as UK Lawyers for Israel, pressure institutions to terminate the contracts of academics who challenge dominant pro Israeli narratives. Such attacks are not grounded in legitimate legal claims, but are rather part of a broader strategy financially destabilize those who speak up for Palestine and intimidate future pro Palestinian voices into silence. This culture of fear leads many scholars to self censor and reduce their political engagement to private conversations. Sound familiar, Care Bear?
yep,
So these acts of repression are not new. Historically, those who challenged dominant power structures, whether during the Cold War under Thatcher's regime or in the wake of more recent movements such as BLM, have always faced retaliation. However, the repression of pro Palestinian voices today reveals a profound hypocrisy. While the West claims to champion freedom of speech, it enforces silence on any issues that threaten its imperial and colonial ambitions. This hypocrisy has been amplified by Western institutions' swift and outspoken condemnations of Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2022. In this context, the role of clandestine publishing becomes critical. Throughout history, from the underground pests in colonial India to the anti psychiatry publications in Europe and the US, that was the ones calling out asylums at the time, right? In case you were wondering. The shock therapy and fucking terrible torture that was happening in those institutions. Um, those oppressed by censorship have turned to anonymous, hidden forms of knowledge production to spread anti-imperialist and anti-capitalist revolutionary thought. These efforts provided invaluable while circulating radical ideas and resisting dominant power structures. I want to remind people, you see all these purple words here, right? In these articles,
Hmm.
these are actually linked, right? So that particular efforts is in relation to this website called revolutionarypapers.org. Again, if you go to the website in the description below, you can get to it. Um, but it's Revolutionary Papers is a transnational research collaboration exploring 20th century periodicals of left, anti-imperial, and anti-colonial critical production. So this is an entire like website dedicated to clandestine publishing in regards to like Kenyan resistance, right? Like, you know, uh pick an anti-colonial topic, right? So I feel like it was a really good resource to kind of showcase. They got teaching tools and all that fun stuff, but go check that out on your own time. But they continue, Palestinians too have a rich tradition of clandestine publishing, particularly during the revolutionary movements of the 1970s, often produced anonymously or pseudonymously. Publications such as Arab Palestinian Resistance, Free Palestine Newspaper, and other pamphlets and periodicals allowed for the dissemination of revolutionary ideas that challenged colonial narratives and affirmed Palestinian self determination. One of these is literally like a PDF linked in the article that you
Yeah.
can actually go read the entire publication from
Hmm.
the 1970s, which we might do at a later date. Um, but other pamphlets and periodicals allowed for the dissemination of revolutionary ideas that challenged colonial narratives and affirmed Palestinian self determination. Similarly, and this I found an interesting connection to this, paper is not the only thing you can publish on, Collin, right? So, uh, Palestinians in refugee camps have always used the walls of their camps to powerfully write the truth for all to see. Without fear of repercussion, today the practice is more relevant than ever in an era where speaking publicly about Palestinian liberation invites severe repercussion. Clandestine knowledge production offers a powerful alternative. So, this is from the article linked right here about using the walls, right?
Hmm.
So, reflecting on his childhood in Wamia camp in the 1970s, Salem Yassin writes of the importance of reading and listening to the camp's walls, what he calls the people's free newspaper. The messages they convey, Yassin suggests, as part of a dialogue with world events and history, as much as they are about internal dialogues within the camp. They are written by the organic intellectuals, ordinary Palestinians who reside in the camps. They convey critical reflections of the world, foster engagement with the world beyond the camp, and call for liberatory or solidarity actions. These days, their writings transcend the physical walls and find their way into the digital realm, prominently featured on Facebook walls and other social media platforms. Since October 7th, the walls of most Palestinian refugee camps in Lebanon have been adorned with murals, posters, and pictures commemorating the attacks, as well as images of martyrs in Abu Abida, the spokesperson for Hamas's Al Qasim brigades. This visual tapestry reinforces the enduring commitment to armed resistance within the community and attempts to minimize the burning distance between Palestine and the camps in Lebanon. On the surface, Hezbollah and its Palestinian allies in the camp, Hamas and the Islamic Jihad, restrict and oversee how and when people can engage in armed struggle against Israel. The post 1991 equilibrium between the Palestinian liberation struggle and Lebanese sovereignty having found a solution in Hezbollah's control over the resistance. But This arrangement leaves many unhappy Palestinian groups who feel they are subordinates to the Islamic resistance, as well as opponents of Hezbollah who argue that the party has taken over the Lebanese state prerogative and acts as proxy of Iran. So here are some of the, things that they are talking about, right? Um, as your standard graffiti. And Collin, listen, I would never tell anyone who wanted to put their message out to do anything illegal. Want to make that clear. I would never suggest doing anything like that, especially if it gets your message across incredibly well. I would not tell anyone to do that. But I think things like this, right? Leaving stuff at your local restaurants, right? Little cards, things like that, QR codes to scan to send them to places. I think that's a pretty effective way myself. How many times have you stopped at one of those boards in a restaurant to look at business cards and things like that? You know what I mean? I don't know if that's just a small town thing or if it's a, your school's got community boards and things like that. And it's not like you got to leave your name and number on it, Just put some tape up, put some posters up, do something. But, anyway, so the university system has historically commodified and extracted knowledge from marginalized communities, but it always stops short of allowing that knowledge to inform real resistance. Universities have circumvented militant knowledge, preached neutrality, demanded knowledge be depoliticized, and confined decolonization to distant history. These institutions demand theory without practice and draw a border between the university and the public. Education and politics, academics and activists, our knowledge production is only useful if it can be a commodified product that brings in more students and money and enhances the university's reputation, but the money we would bring in would then be invested in our own genocide.
Capitalism.
So, any thoughts so far, Care Bear?
I mean, as you said, if you want to kind of get, well, as I tell my students, the idea of writing is to communicate ideas.
Yeah.
And then, but you have to find a medium in order for you to do that. Now, obviously, the mediums that they would have typically or traditionally are gone or very limited. So you have to figure out another way to be able to do it, but a way to kind of do it safely so that, you're able to get the information that you need to get out there out, but without, having people track you or whatever, especially if the content is a little more, as I would say, a little more spicy, we'll say.
Yeah.
So, but I can also see this in terms of, there's a lot here that I can kind of pull from, and it doesn't have to be necessarily like written text. It can be through art, as, just tradition. Well, back in the day, especially for people that can read, you often use art as a way to kind of tell story or kind of communicate information. So, especially for the working class that typically would not be able to do that, I can also kind of see that and you probably did see it in the pictures there, that you can see some semblance of that there. But then obviously trying to use, again, walls, like we call it graffiti, but street art or whatever you want to call it here. So there's a lot in terms of art and literacy kind of being intertwined in order to communicate the messages that people want to share. Is very apparent here.
So I follow this person on Twitter, and I suggest people do so by the name of Chloe. Right here, I'll pull it up. Scroll down to this kind of stuff all the time. So, so let's let's close those. But they post Palestinian art all the time, right?
Hmm.
So this is at, what is that, at KLOWEY, right?
I
Um,
can't see.
oh,
It's
you
hard to
can't
see it from my
see?
screen. Well, I
Um,
can see, but it's hard to read.
hard to read. Do this and this. There we go. And that. Cool. But like, yeah, I mean, they just post stuff like this all the time, which, as you were talking about,
Hmm.
with, you know, art in general being another form of this publication. You know what I
Right.
mean?
Yeah,
Um,
it's just like a literary magazine,
yep.
but not in a magazine,
Yeah.
essentially.
So,
Like in terms of paper and binding it together,
yep.
so just yeah.
And I think the art just speaks somehow easier. Like, it just has a
Hmm.
lot more emotions and stuff tied to it. But um, just to continue with this article a bit, as Edward Said reminds us, the role of the intellectual is to speak truth to power, and yet today's academic structure constrain our ability to do so. The pressure to publish
Yep.
in prestigious journals, secure conditional grants, and adhere to the Western model of named authorship limits our capacity to produce militant, collective knowledge that can truly challenge systems of oppression. It strangulates any time spent sharing our knowledge with our communities, seeking to end our own financial and immigration precarity amid the cesspit of late stage capitalism and militarized borders. We sacrifice the radicalism of our thoughts while also entrenching financially and socially the very systems and ideas we seek to dismantle. And that's by design. But embracing clandestine publishing, we reject the commodification of knowledge and the constraints of Western individualism. We center the collective over the individual, the struggle over the author. This strategy, borrowed from revolutionary movements across history, allow us to bypass the structure that seek to censor and punish us, creating spaces for radical ideas to thrive and circulate beyond the confines of institutional power. Resisting the commodification of knowledge also requires resisting novelty. Clandestine writing does not necessarily have to be new. It can also involve the revisiting of revolutionary ideas from the past and archival sources that have been suppressed by the passage of time and institutional power hierarchies, returning revolutionary knowledge to our collective struggle. Ultimately, we must recognize that our energies are better spent outside the academy and in strategically extracting its resources to fuel our anti colonial work elsewhere. It is time to return to the archives of insurgent knowledge, revive the revolutionary spirit of past movements, and produce knowledge that resists self censorship and affirms the struggle for Palestinian liberation by all means necessary. In times of intensified repression, clandestine publishing becomes a necessity and a vital form of intellectual and political survival. As censorship tightens, we must draw from history, learn from past movements, and rely on one another to keep the flame of resistance burning. This is not a call to abandon the academic space entirely, but to master the art of navigating both worlds, maintaining our presence within institutional frameworks while never losing sight of the collective struggle. To go underground as academics means to learn from the endurance of Palestinian resistance, the steadfastness of Gaza, and the struggle of Palestinian prisoners. It is to call to learn rather than teach, to apply knowledge rather than extract it. The tunnels dug by Palestinian prisoners with spoons and those created by Gaza's resistance symbolize a reorientation of our approach, teaching us to think not just laterally, but vertically. Subverting spatial barriers and borders, these tunnels remind us to delve into our collective history of knowledge, production to republish what has been buried or scattered in lost archives, and to make accessible what's been withheld by institutional gatekeepers. Doing so teaches us to reject the Western capitalist drive for constant novelty, which seeks to erase the wisdom of militant generations before us. The words of those who were often assassinated for their ideas remain alive. To learn from Palestinian resistance is to carve and dig escape tunnels from academia's mental production lines with pens as our tools. We go underground not to bury our heads and remain hidden, but to traverse and dismantle the borders that confine us. We go underground to emerge stronger, to speak loudly and radically in spaces where our voices are suppressed, and to break through the boundaries that seek to silence us. So, I told you we'd get to the name of the author, right? So,
Mhm.
Aziz Yafi is a pseudonym. The writer chose as an ode to the same pen name used by Dr. Abu Wahab al Khalili, founder and editor of a Free Palestine newspaper published in London between 1968 and 1984. He was assassinated by Israel in 1981, but his pen name continued to be used as an editorial byline until 1991, according to archival material found by the writer of this article. So, I find that an interesting tactic, you know, and you know, probably a lovely honoring. So, anyway, your thoughts, Care Bear, before we head out of here?
Yeah, just last thought. So over the weekend, I went to a book signing slash lecture with former foreign correspondent to the Washington Post, John. Yeah, I
Hmm.
told you, talked to you about this one. So he has a new book out. No, I don't have the book on me right now. It's back there. Um, but he wrote a book based on class in America,
Yeah.
especially among Black people. And but what he talked about, which I thought was interesting, kind of related to this, is how the Palestinians got a lot. Not to say they got inspired, but in many ways they got inspiration in terms of resistance from the Black Power movement that was happening in this country. Well, you can argue in the West during the 60s. And
Hmm.
we talked about Kwame Ture at the beginning of the show. He was a huge component of the Black Power movement. So it kind of makes sense. And given what we know of the Black Panthers, a lot of this stuff was underground. A lot of the stuff, was kind of done in secret, not to make themselves like kind of in your face. But it was
Yeah.
still this idea of sharing information, strategizing, in terms of organization and all that kind of stuff. So a lot of that, I could definitely see kind of being implemented, in this way. But the idea that the software mentions, an intellectual is a person who speaks truth to power. I
Right.
think being in education, I feel that idea is definitely lost because more often than not, you're not trained to speak the truth. You're trained to regurgitate propaganda based on what other people tell you is acceptable and not to deviate from that. Whereas here, it's the idea of really truly seeking knowledge in terms of really discovering and my guess is also debating, and I think just being more in tune with the world and what is happening around and using other people groups means of resistance in order to reflect their own and in order to kind of communicate those ideas and as well as strategies to support their own movement. So
Yep.
it's very it seems like it's very communal in a
Yeah.
sense, in terms of wanting all this information to be shared among the community, but kind of bringing your own spin to it. And, as I said earlier, it reminds me more of like a literary magazine. You mentioned, we mentioned at the beginning of the show, kind of what the Who movement has been doing,
Yep.
like not relying on resources that are already created, but creating their own and having the means to do their own thing. Um, Now, obviously, in Palestine, a lot of those infrastructure is limited, if not destroyed completely. So having to find other ways, which I think just even that creativity, kind of like out of
Scratch that crap in clay
necessity.
tablets. Do something.
Right, right.
Like,
So yeah, just seeing a lot of that resistance thinking, but then like using what the resources that they have in order to create and to share and to motivate people to be powerful in terms of uh, how they communicate in terms of fighting for
Yep.
resistance.
I also found the whole take on anonymity was interesting here, right? As like
Hmm.
a tool to allow yourself more freedom to like, I think it kind of opened my eyes up to possibilities there, especially like in and around the workplace. If you could leave pamphlets without people knowing who did it and who left, you know what I mean? Like any of those kind of things. You leave that little red book in the break room and see if someone else reads it, you know?
Right.
Like that kind of stuff I feel like is not a bad idea, really. And I think that's been lost on people. That level of like, you know, using your talents, however small, to like enact like real thought outside of,
Hmm.
the influence they would let you have, especially digitally. I think suppression is so rampant, you know, that like doing that kind of thing to push even your digital side of that publishing also very useful.
Hmm.
So
Right.
it's a thought. So, you know, but yeah, I'm sure talking about ways to get around suppression is probably why we're demonetized. You can go to kodashv.com/indie-news-network to help keep our lights on. Scan that QR code on your screen if you're so inclined. But if you can't do that, sharing this video is probably the best way to help. Liking and subscribing, leaving comments, doing all that engagement stuff you're supposed to. We're getting our number up on that old subscription count, so help us get to 3K. But otherwise, thanks for watching.